Hi, class. Today we're looking at the Australian film Rabbit Proof Fence for our Culture and Literature of the English Speaking World course. I apologize, I'm having some issues with the screencasting software, and sometimes it's jumping several slides ahead. So I'll just go back when that does that. So apologies for that situation. So the goals for today's class, we're going to look at how to link information from the Australia chapter to the film, look at analyzing the film within its historical context, and gaining a greater understanding of the Aboriginal community and the effects of what we're going to see in the film. So hopefully you all had an opportunity to see the film, which will make this a much more interesting lecture, of course. So I thought we should begin with a brief look at the stolen generation, or what exactly that is, and give you a little bit more information for some context. One way to begin would be to putting yourself in the situation of what was happening here. Of course, it's almost impossible to actually determine what you would do or how this would feel, but we look at the situation imagining someone comes to your house and takes you or one of your brothers or sisters, and you didn't know why. You weren't really sure what was going on. And of course, there was not much you could do because the people that showed up to take them came with police officers who would insist on the children being taken. And can you imagine what this would do to your family? How would your parents react if this happened? How would you react? What would be the feelings involved there? So we're going to watch a little bit of a video kind of discussing the situation.
Like many countries formed under colonialism, Australia has a pretty horrible track record of mistreating its Indigenous people, the Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders, many of whom have become known as the Stolen Generation. Why do they call it the Stolen Generation?
Because it was a whole generation of kids that was taken from their home. Basically, you either had to be black or white. You couldn't be brown or in the middle.
So they would consider you in the middle and you would have been
taken.
Not kidding. Up until 1970s, by law, any Indigenous child who looked like he or she had any amount of white ancestry in them could be snatched from their families and forcibly assimilated into white society.
My grandfather, my mum's father, he was part of the Stolen Generation. He was really young, taken out.
How old is he?
Maybe a year old when he was taken.
Oh, wow. So he never knew his real family.
He knew because when he was taken from the front yard of where they lived.
Wait, what? He was in the front yard and somebody just pulled up and took him?
Yeah, policemen or rangers would come, pull up, just grab these half-coloured kids or coloured kids and then chuck them in the truck and then take them.
As the little boy was being forced into the back of a truck, his aunt, a young child herself, sacrificed her own freedom so he wouldn't be alone.
When she heard the commotion of him crying and screaming, she ran and voluntarily just jumped on.
Light-skinned children were often adopted by European families, while darker-skinned children, like Deanne's grandfather, were sent to missionary camps.
Most of the missions were based on islands, so
And
they'd take you, send you away, let you grow up there in a mission and learn about, the Catholic side of it and a European way. You'd learn English and then
try to make you forget your family?
Yeah.
You never got to see them, or?
Yeah, you never ever got to see them. There was no such thing as visiting hours. He spent the rest of it on the island until he was like 18, 19. When he came off, he knew...
18 or 19 years old and basically a prison.
Yeah, on an island.
Just for being born.
Yep, just for being born light.
To protect their children, some Aboriginal families resorted to extreme measures, using the sap of the milkwood tree.
My great-grandparents painted my grandmother because she was fairly light.
Yeah.
Painted her all black, put the sap on her, hid her in the billabongs, creeks, rivers, and they never found her.
So they did that so that they wouldn't take her and put her in the schools?
Yeah, so it was a whole generation that was stolen away.
Oh.
But lucky for the tree and the paint, my grandmother wasn't. So.
Huh. Wow. Deanne's grandmother dyed her skin until her 20s, and she was one of the lucky ones. It's believed that over 50,000 children were stolen between the 1860s and the 1970s. over 100 years later when the laws were finally changed. But the ones who were taken have suffered ever since. With no identity, family, or bonds, many now suffer from homelessness, alcoholism, and other issues. Thank you for sharing your story. That was really powerful and amazing. And your grandparents sound really wonderful and strong. I don't know how my grandparents would have reacted.
It's good to share.
So as we saw in the video, even at the end, the host was saying, I have no idea how my grandparents would have reacted. It's almost an unimaginable situation. But this did occur, and it's essentially called the Stolen Generation. So as we can see in this picture from a newspaper, we can see a group of children that they're seeking homes for. And the comment at the bottom, if you can't make it out, says, "I like the little girl in the center of the group. But if taken by anyone else, any of the others will do as long as they are strong." So you can see the lightest skinned child in the picture is the preferred one. And if they can't get their preferred one, better get one that's strong, because they're definitely going to be used in some type of service capacity. So let's look a little bit deeper at the Stolen Generation and provide a little bit of context for the movie as well as discussing the movie. During the 1800s, this system developed. The colonial authorities, which is the white Australians, the British Australians, believed the best way to look after the indigenous was to create what they called a protection system. So similar to the Indian reservations in the United States of America, they set up special communities for them, places where they could live, where they could farm, and where they were supplied. So you might recognize this from the beginning of the movie. You may have not been sure where they were because there were these Aboriginals, but then there was also these colonials, and they had like a shop, but they were just giving them things. And this is the special communities. They would provide a few things like clothes, food, clothing, etc. A few problems with this is a lot of the indigenous people were traditionally nomadic, so it was real difficult to get used to this community system. And then they passed the Aboriginal Protection Act in the 1900s, and that gave the white authorities license to, as it says here, provide for the custody, maintenance, and education of the children of Aborigines. So the custody means essentially it's another word for ownership, and then who will maintain them, raise them, and educate them. So this became official policy in the 1900s, and children were removed from their indigenous families. They had the power to remove children without parental consult, without a court order, for reasons that ranged from being destitute and neglected, which of course is a very subjective determination. And the justification was they needed to be removed from their families for their moral and spiritual welfare. You can see a lot of issues with this. How do you determine if someone is destitute or neglected? So we saw in the movie, in the community centers, the white colonials handing out used clothing, which the indigenous people would wear, which is one way that you could determine they were neglected, because they had old clothing, giving them a reason to be removed. And so the white government believed this was the best way to help these children, was to assimilate them into European society by force, if necessary. And so this isn't the first time we've come across the word assimilation. Here's a definition, in a sense. All persons of Aboriginal or mixed blood in Australia would live like other white Australians do. Essentially, this is to erase the Aboriginal culture. You need to believe what we believe. Your beliefs don't matter, because our beliefs are better. Our education system is better. Our morals are better. And this was the justification given for taking them. Like I said, this isn't the first time we've come across assimilation. So this is a good time to work in pairs, or just hit pause for a minute and kind of think, what are some of the issues related to assimilation? We've seen this word previously. We've seen it in our discussions of Ireland, our discussions of Canada, the US. In particular, when we discussed Canada, we talked about how they have become a model of multiculturalism. And one of the first things they did was learn from the mistakes of the past, and they identified how one of the largest mistakes that countries have made is to institute an assimilation policy. So you might want to pause the video for a minute and kind of think, how would you answer? What are some issues related to assimilation? Well, hopefully you've considered the question, and you may have come up with some ideas about how assimilation forces people to think that their core values or beliefs are wrong, how it leads to a loss of cultural identity, how it leads to a loss of language, and these are kind of core concepts that we have for identifying who we are. And when you take them away, then it's really hard to figure out who you are. So as part of this policy, they weren't allowed to speak their native language or have contact with their relatives. We saw this in the movie when the three girls are moved to the missionary camp. When they try to speak their language, they're admonished. And their education was based on the Christian Bible. And you can kind of see how they were prepared for life. The girls were taught how to sew and clean, and the boys were taught how to garden and stock, essentially preparing them for a life of service for white families. In fact, once the girls turned 14 years old, they were expected to find employment with white families as domestics, as servants. And we can see by the 1980s, around about 100,000 children had been removed. And as we saw in the video from before, they identified 50,000 children. Here we're saying about 100,000. And the sad truth of the matter is that no one really knows how many children were removed, because there weren't court orders or organization of this. So looking at a little graphic of why Aboriginal girls specifically were taken, we can see the number one thing wasn't for their moral or their educational development. It was to send them to service in white families, essentially a form of slavery. We can see the second one is that the girls were deemed neglected, but who makes this determination? And I thought interesting, number 3, other reasons were identified as being an Aboriginal was another reason to be removed from an Aboriginal settlement. And combined with number 4, which was basically could encapsulate all of them, there's just no reason given why they were taken. So as the movie we watched is based on a novel, we can see this post-colonial struggle comes out in the forms of different types of media, novels, films, but also comes out in songs as well. So we're going to take a look at at a song, and I want you to think about, what does the song tell you about the stolen generation? So you can read the lyrics. We're also going to listen to the lyrics. And so you might want to think about what these lyrics are saying about the stolen generation.
This story's right, this story's true. I would not tell lies to you, like the promises they did not keep, and how they fenced us in like sheep. Said to us, come take our hand, set us up on mission land, told us to read, to write and pray. Then they took the children away, took the children away, the children away. Snatched from their mother's breast, said this is for the best, took them away. Welcome and the police came, said you've got to understand, we'll give to them what you can't give. Teach them how to really live. Teach them how to live themselves. Humiliated them instead. Taught them that, and taught them this, and others taught them prejudice. children away, the children away. Breaking our mother's heart, tearing us all apart, took them away. One dark day on traveling man came and didn't give a damn. My mother cried, go get their dad. He came running and frightened me. Mother's tears were falling down. Dad shaped up and stood his ground. He said, you touch my kid and you fight me. Then they took the stronger man on me, took us away.
So we can see the events of the Stolen Generation have manifested themselves in a variety of movies, novels, and songs. And this is a famous one by Archie Roach. So when we look at what does this song tell you about the Stolen Generation, we just need to look at the lyrics. We see words like lies, fenced us in like sheep, so treating us like animals, took the children away. We see charged words like snatched from their mother's breast, humiliated, taught them prejudice. And if we continue on further, we essentially see the story developing because we were acting white, yet we felt black. So again, that kind of loss of cultural and maybe even racial identity. So that leads us to the actual film itself. With a little bit of background knowledge now, we can look at Rabbit Proof Fence. We can see the film was directed in 2002. It is based on a true story and from a novel called Follow the Rabbit Proof Fence. Written by the actual daughter of Molly from the movie, so that's kind of an interesting twist. And we see our story set in 1931 at Jigalong in Western Australia. And so it's important. Why is this movie called Rabbit Proof Fence? Where does the name come from? Well, we can see that the Rabbit Proof Fence was actually this fence, the longest fence in the world at one time, built to keep rabbits from destroying certain crops. And it becomes important in the movie as a symbol in one respect and also as a guide in another. So this would be a good time. You could pause the video for a second and think, why did they name the movie Rabbit Proof Fence? Well, hopefully after thinking about it, you can relate the question to the movie itself and how the fence ended up being a guide for them, hence making it a good title for the movie. When we look at the characters, we see our three main characters in the form of Molly, Gracie, and Daisy. These are the Aboriginal children, heartbreakingly taken away from their parents at the beginning of the movie and put into the Moore River institution for mixed race children. And not only do they try to escape, they successfully escape. And so this will bring us to a few discussion questions. And this is a pretty good practice for possible test questions that you may see, particularly in the form of short and long answers. So on the next couple of slides, you're going to see some discussion questions, and it would be appropriate to pause the video for just a minute. Think about how you would answer this question, or if you're able to answer the question, and that might give you some areas you may need to go study or think about again. So we can ask a question about what happens in the early goings of the movie. So the girls escape the institution and they spend the night out in the desert alone, and they wake up. And what do Molly and Daisy see when they wake up in the desert? Why is it important for them? What does it symbolize? And what does Molly say and do when she sees this thing? So take a quick pause, see if you can recall from the movie what this is and why it might be important. So They wake up in the desert and they see the spirit bird. This is important because it symbolizes home and is meant to always lead them where they need to go. So they take this as a really good sign. In fact, Molly points up to the spirit bird and says home, and then calls out to the bird. And this is a nice reflection because at the very beginning of the movie, we see Molly's parents explaining the importance of the spirit bird and how it will always guide them where they need to go. Moving on to another character, we see Mr. Neville. He is the chief protector of Aboriginals. He's the one who signs the order to take the girls away from their family, and he's the one who constantly tries to catch them sending out various types of people after the girls amazingly evade escape. So this could be a good point where we could have a discussion question regarding Mr. Neville. Because at the end of the film, he states, "We face an uphill battle with these people, especially the bush natives, who have to be protected against themselves. If they would only understand what we are trying to do for them." And this is an interesting quote, which kind of shows his perspective or maybe lack of perspective on the situation. But it allows us to have a little discussion about this character. So his official title is Chief Protector, yet the children call him Devil. So these are some good questions we could ask. Is who is he actually protecting? And why do the children call him Devil? How would you describe Neville and why? So again, a good moment to pause the video and kind of reflect on how you would answer some of these questions. Well, obviously the first thing is why do they call him Devil? The easy one is it rhymes with Neville, of course, but actually in the beginning of the movie, we do see this term related to the people that are taking the children away. And the idea that he's chief protector of the Aboriginals is very contradictory, very ironic, because what he's actually protecting is the idea of colonialism itself. He's protecting the notion of white superiority. So it's really not about protecting the Aboriginals. It's about protecting the white base of power, essentially. And as far as how you would describe him and why, of course, reactions would vary. But if we're trying to relate the film back to the chapter, using the textbook information, how could you justify Neville's actions? So think about things that we read about in the textbook that we discussed in the previous lecture and try to relate them to Neville's actions in the movie. Again, this would be a good point to pause and kind of reflect on what the answer might be. So hopefully you were able to identify a policy that we read about in the book as well as discussed in class that are the reasons for Neville's actions. So if you weren't able to identify the White Australia policy, there's definitely a very strong connection between this film and that policy. So make sure you're familiar with it. So moving along later into the movie, we see that the girls aren't sure where to go. They're getting a little bit lost, and they come across the rabbit-proof fence. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to look at a map a little bit. So we can see here is Jigalong, and down here is the Moore River Native Settlement. So they escape from here, and they take I believe it's around a 1,200 kilometer journey back to their home via the rabbit-proof fence. So eventually some of them are going to make it to Jigalong, which leads to our next discussion question. What do Molly and Daisy do when they reach Jigalong? And what happens to them in the future? So, of course, beyond celebrating with their family and being happy, what happens next in the movie? And then also at the very end of the movie, you get a bit of a description of the future, what happens to them. So a good opportunity to pause and kind of think how you would answer this question. Well, when they do get to Jigalong, as indicated in the video we saw before, they go and hide in the desert to avoid capture, essentially. And we can kind of see at the end of the movie, they paint one of the daughter's faces to make it a bit darker, and then they head off into the bush to hide away from the authorities. What happens then in the future is a highly interesting and terribly sad story where Molly actually gets married and has 2 daughters, but then she and her daughters are captured and taken back to the Moore River Institute. And we see Molly escapes again, and she walks all the way back to Jigalong again. So this journey is repeated while she's carrying her small daughter, Annabelle. And then in another sad and heartbreaking twist, we see Annabelle when she's 3 years old. She gets captured again, and we find out that Molly actually never sees her daughter again, bringing the movie to a sad conclusion. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the Australian flag, but this is also a flag that we see in Australia. Can you guess what flag it is? This is the Aboriginal flag. We can see the black represents the Aboriginal people. The yellow represents the sun, which for the Aboriginal followers is a giver of life and protection. And the red is the red earth, which is very common in Aboriginal ceremonies, symbolizing their connection to nature and the land. So what we see through the part of the chapter that we read, as well as the movie, we can see this kind of timeline of the stolen generation of the Aboriginal policy, the protection policy, up until 1969 when it was officially removed. But what happens after that? So it's important to look at the impact of this situation. So here's a brief timeline up to 2008. We can see that there's a commission established to kind of investigate the stolen generation. There was a going home conference. There was an official report called Bringing Them Home, which we will discuss a little bit in depth in just a minute. We have these participatory walks throughout Australia as a way to say sorry, which apparently in Australia saying sorry has a lot more significance and meaning than it does in American English because it's a very casual thing. But here they're using it like in an official way. We see conferences to discuss ways to make amends. We see memorials built. And looking at ways to make amends, in 2008, the Prime Minister makes a formal apology. Before we look at that apology, we want to look what brought about that apology, and that was the Bringing Home report from 1995. This was a national inquiry where they basically obtained evidence of what happened and why it happened and who maybe was to blame for it. And there was a lot of evidence presented. Of course, it found that forcibly removing children from their families is a violation of human rights. And the interesting thing was that this continued well after Australia had committed to preserving international human rights abroad. So it's interesting to see that it was important overseas, but not so important at home. It was found that the policy was racially discriminatory, of course. And it was actually deemed an act of genocide, contrary to the Convention on Genocide, which Australia had signed, because forcibly transferring children from one group to another with an intention of destroying that group is considered an act of genocide. So this was obviously not a very good look for Australia at the time. But one of the results of the report was that a formal and official apology needs to be presented from the Australian government to the Aboriginal people. So we're going to take a look at this apology, and you can judge for yourself whether you feel it's genuine, whether you feel it's authentic, whether you feel it's actually spoken to the people that is meant to address.
Today we honour the Indigenous peoples of this land, the oldest continuing cultures in human history. We reflect on their past mistreatment. We reflect in particular on the mistreatment of those who were stolen generations, this blemished chapter in our national history. The time has now come for the nation to turn a new page in Australia's history by righting the wrongs of the past and so moving forward with confidence to the future. We apologise for the laws and policies of successive parliaments and governments that have inflicted profound grief, suffering and loss on these our fellow Australians. We apologise especially for the removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, their communities and their country. For the pain, suffering and hurt of these stolen generations, their descendants and for their families left behind, we say sorry. To the mothers and the fathers, the brothers and the sisters, for the breaking up of families and communities, we say sorry. And for the indignity and degradation thus inflicted on a proud people and a proud culture, we say sorry. We, the Parliament of Australia, respectfully request that this apology be received in the spirit in which it is offered, as part of the healing of the nation. For the future, we take heart, resolving that this new page in the history of our great continent can now be written. We today take this first step by acknowledging the past and laying claim to a future that embraces all Australians. A future where this Parliament resolves that the injustices of the past must never, never happen again. A future where we harness the determination of all Australians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to close the gap that lies between us and life expectancy, educational achievement and economic opportunity. A future where we embrace the possibility of new solutions to enduring problems where old approaches have failed. A future based on mutual respect, mutual resolve and mutual responsibility. A future where all Australians, whatever their origins, are truly equal partners with equal opportunities and with an equal stake in shaping the next chapter in the history of this great country, Australia. So it's up to you to decide whether you felt the speech, the apology, was genuine or not. Who's to say? I did notice a large lack of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities at the apology, so only they would really know. But looking at the results of the stolen generation of this act that transpired, we can see there have been physical and emotional damage as a result of this action. The hostile environment created for the Indigenous people resulted in this lack of cultural identity, which we talked about before, how important that is to understanding who we are. We can see the resulting effect of insecurity, self-esteem issues, feelings of worthlessness, and there's been heavy depression, suicide, violence, alcohol, and drug abuse in the Aboriginal community as a result of this policy. And you can imagine there were large-scale consequences for the community, feelings of anger and powerlessness, and of course a distrust of government, police, officials that still exists to this day. When we look a little bit further at the lasting impact, some recent independent reviews show powerful effects still. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are 50% more likely to be charged by police, 30% less likely to have good health, 10% less likely to have a job.
So this has a strong and lasting impact on this community. And so I'd like to finish up by reflecting on how this is a prime example of post-colonial literature, and some interesting things that you might want to look at when discussing post-colonial literature, whether it be in the form of literature, film, songs, art, whatever the case may be. Remember that this type of literature examines the relationship between the colonizers and the colonized. So looking at Rabbit Proof Fence, we can ask, is this work pro or anti-colonialist? And of course, you should be able to identify that this is anti-colonialist, but you should also be able to answer the question why by providing specific examples from the movie. So this is something that we might see in the form of a short or a long form answer on a test. Considering, does the text or the film reinforce or resist colonialist ideology, you should also be able to provide a fairly thorough answer on this with examples from the book and or movie. Another aspect worth looking into post-colonialism is the type of oppression used. So what tools do the colonizers use? We discussed this when looking at the character of Mr. Neville and the White Australia policy. So you should be familiar with that policy and be able to relate it to the movie and how it had an impact on the characters as well as the movie itself. And when we look at what is the psychological aftermath for the colonized people, well, the previous two slides went over this extensively. So it's always good to kind of take this idea, this theoretical idea of harm that has been caused by colonizers, and turn it into, be able to discuss it in practical terms. So it's good to assimilate information from the book, be able to apply it to the film, and then provide an educated response. And as we looked at Rabbit Proof Fence, the film, which is based on a novel, we also looked at a song. I thought it might be nice to look with the impact of the Stolen Generation on art. And we can see this come in the form of a painting by the artist Jackie Stewart. You can, at the bottom, you can kind of see the symbolism. So I'll leave it up to you. I just thought it was an interesting way to end because this is a piece of art based on the movie Rabbit Proof Fence, and kind of showing the symbolism of the Aboriginals, as well as their kind of connection to nature. So thank you very much for listening to this video lecture. I hope you found it informative. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to send me an email or ask in class. Thank you. Have a great day.